You call this a business? Scoffed my brother Lucas, his polished leather shoes echoing across the terrazzo floor of my small boutique. It's barely bigger than my laundry room. I kept arranging the rows of artisanal candles on the shelves, refusing to let him see how his words stung. Morning sunlight poured through the wide front windows, casting golden light on the rows of hand-poured candles, each scent blended and poured by me in the workshop behind the shop. At least I have customers who pay me, I murmured, lining up a lavender candle. How's your fourth investment fund doing? Lucas's jaw tightened, the smirk fading from his carefully groomed face. That's different, Sophie, he snapped. I think big. I take real risks. This? He waved a dismissive hand at the walls of my boutique, with its soft music and shelves of glowing glass jars. This is playing it safe. The bell above the door tinkled, and I glanced up to see my parents walking in. Perfect. The entire family show had arrived. Dad scanned my 850-square-foot store and sighed heavily. I knew that look. I'd seen it ever since I declined the marketing director role at his company, Whitaker & Sons Imports, to chase my own dreams. Sophie, he said, his voice dropping into the condescending tone that made my skin crawl, your mother and I worry about you. You're 32, and this is all you've managed? I swallowed the sharp retort that burned on my tongue. They had no idea what I'd been building behind the scenes while they dismissed my little candle shop. We're having dinner tonight, Mom added, pushing back a loose strand of silver hair and adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. To celebrate some very big news, Whitaker & Sons is about to finalize the biggest deal in its history. That's great, I said, keeping my tone polite. But I've got a new shipment coming in tonight. Inventory to handle. Lucas let out a soft laugh. This is exactly why you're stuck in this tiny space. While Dad's about to sign a $120 million 0-cents contract with Meridian Global, you're fussing over wax and wicks. I froze for half a second. Meridian Global? They didn't know. This merger will change everything, Dad said, puffing his chest out a bit. Once we lock down Meridian's supply chain, Whitaker & Sons will control the entire West Coast market. I fought to keep my expression steady, picturing the stack of legal documents locked in my office safe. No, not in my shop office, but in my other office on the 19th floor of a gleaming tower in downtown Portland. You should come to dinner, Sophie, Mom urged. Meet some real business people, people who could help you think bigger. The irony almost made me laugh. Because sitting in that safe downtown was my secret, my controlling stake in Meridian Global. And soon, my father was going to discover that the person holding all the cards in his precious merger was the daughter he'd always underestimated. If they only knew that their precious merger, the one they were practically bragging about, couldn't happen without my signature. Because while they were so busy scoffing at my little candle shop, none of them had the faintest idea that 5 years ago, I quietly founded Larkspur Holdings, now the parent company of Meridian Global. I'm sorry, I said lightly, but I have other commitments tonight. Not sorry at all. Dad's jaw tightened, shadows darkening his expression. There's that attitude again. This is why you'll never succeed in business, Sophie. You don't understand the importance of connections, of showing up when it matters. I said nothing as they finally left. Lucas pausing at the door to cast one last snare around my boutique, as though he couldn't wait to escape the scent of sandalwood and beeswax. The bell over the door jingled softly behind them, a cheerful sound at odds with the chill they'd left hanging in the air. I pulled out my phone and dialed my assistant at Larkspur Holdings. Marisol, move up tomorrow's meeting with Whitaker & Sons to 9A and make sure the cameras in the boardroom are recording. I want every expression saved for the record when they discover who they've really been dealing with. Of course, Miss Whitaker, she replied crisply. The next morning, I arrived early at Larkspur Holdings headquarters, striding through the glass atrium in my sharpest charcoal gray suit. My little candle shop would be just fine without me for a few hours. After all, it was partly a passion project, a creative outlet that had, somehow, become my family's favorite punchline. As I settled into my office on the 19th floor, I flipped through the merger documents one last time. I thought about how none of my family had ever bothered to truly look at my shop. If they had, They might have noticed that each candle I poured was crafted with essential oils sourced from rare botanicals, materials that required access to highly regulated supply chains. Supply chains, incidentally, that Meridian Global had been trying to tap into for years. My intercom buzzed. Mrs. Whitaker, the Whitaker and Sons team has arrived. I smiled and rose, smoothing my suit jacket. Perfect timing, let's give them a warm welcome. Because sometimes, the tiniest shops hide the most powerful secrets. And my family was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I stood behind the one-ways glass, watching as my family entered the sleek conference room. Dad carried himself with his usual swagger, adjusting his navy tie as he settled into a chair at the table. Lucas dropped into the seat beside him, eyes glued to his phone, likely drafting some dramatic LinkedIn post about being part of a historic acquisition. Mom stood by the window, gazing out at the Portland skyline, a view that, ironically, included my small candle shop just blocks away. The CEO of Larkspur Holdings will be joining us shortly, Marisol announced, as she placed sparkling water glasses in front of each guest. Lucas shot Marisol a look of faint curiosity, no doubt admiring her elegant suit and assuming she was just the CEO's assistant. I still don't see why we need the parent company's sign-off, Dad grumbled. We've already hammered out everything with Meridian Global's board. I glanced at my reflection in the glass, feeling a jolt of pride. 5 years of meticulous planning, of keeping my true identity separate from the family who never took me seriously, had led me straight to this moment. I'd built an empire, and now it was time for them to see it. I'd built Larkspur Holdings from the ground up, using the supply chain connections I'd developed through my candle business to create a resources and technology empire that now owned several major corporations, including Meridian Global. Taking a steadying breath, I pushed open the door to the conference room. The reaction was immediate. Dad's pen slipped from his fingers and hit the glossy table with a sharp clack. Lucas's phone dropped into his lap, his eyes wide. Mom, turning away from the view of downtown Portland, stumbled slightly, gripping the back of a chair. "Sophie?" Dad croaked. What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." I walked calmly to the head of the table, setting my slim leather briefcase down with deliberate precision. "Actually, Dad," I said coolly, "I'm right where I belong." I glanced at Marisol, who stepped forward immediately. "Please distribute the contracts, Marisol." Lucas gave a shaky laugh. "Oh my God, Sophie, did you get hired as someone's assistant here? You should told us." "Not quite," I said, sliding into the chair at the head of the table and folding my hands neatly. "I'm the CEO and founder of Larkspur Holdings. I have been for 5 years now." The silence that fell was thick enough to choke on. Dad's face shifted from confusion to a kind of pale shock, then to a faint greenish hue. Mom lowered herself into a chair as though her knees had given out. "That's impossible," Lucas stammered, shaking his head as though trying to clear it. "You run a little candle shop." "Yes, I do," I said evenly, relishing the stunned looks around the table. "It's my passion project, but it's also how I discovered a rather lucrative opportunity in the supply markets for rare botanicals and regulated ingredients." I flipped open the thick contract in front of me. "And those profits helped me build this company." I met Dad's eyes steadily. "Now, about this merger." Dad finally found his voice, though it cracked under the strain. "What conditions are you talking about?" "Well, for starters," I said, turning a page in the contract, "Whitaker and Sons' current leadership structure needs significant changes." Dad bristled. "Now wait, just..." "Oh, Dad, you wait?" My voice rang out, echoing slightly in the sleek conference room. "For years you dismissed my ideas, mocked my choices, acted like I was destined to fail because I didn't follow your exact path. You never once bothered to look closer at my so-called tiny shop, or ask if I might be doing anything else." I leaned forward, my tone calm but cutting. "You were so convinced I was a disappointment that you never saw me becoming your business partner, let alone your boss." Lucas just shook his head, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "But your shop, it's so small," he finally managed. I smiled faintly. Size isn't everything, Lucas. The conference room fell silent again, the weight of the moment settling over the table like a thick Portland fog. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the overlooked daughter behind a counter of candles. I was the woman holding the pen over the fate of Whitaker and Sons. If you're ready to see how Sophie turns the tables and reshapes her family's empire, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. Something you might have realized, I said, voice smooth as glass, if you'd spent more time building sustainable businesses instead of chasing quick profits. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out another crisp document. This is a complete restructuring plan for Whitaker and Sons. I laid the packet gently in front of Dad. If you want this merger to happen, these changes are non-negotiable. Mom finally found her voice, though it trembled. Darling, surely we can discuss this as a family? That's exactly what we're doing, I replied coolly, leaning back in my chair. Isn't this what you wanted, Mom, for me to meet with real business people? Well, I spread my hands slightly. Here I am. Dad flipped through the document, each page drawing a deeper crease into his forehead. His knuckles whitened around the edges of the paper. This, he murmured, this would mean stepping down as CEO. Yes, I said firmly, it would. The new CEO will be someone who values innovation and understands modern business practices. Someone who doesn't judge success by the size of a storefront. The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by the faint sound of Lucas swallowing hard and the soft sniffle of Mom dabbing her eyes. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, I said, rising from my chair. Either accept these terms, or Larkspur Holdings will find another company to acquire, one that shares our vision for the future. I turned and headed for the glass door. Sophie, wait. Dad's voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. We didn't know. I paused and met his eyes. No, Dad, you didn't. And that, I thought bitterly, had always been the problem. The next 24 hours were interesting, to say the least. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages from family members, some furious, some pleading, some trying desperately to negotiate. I ignored every one of them. Instead, I spent the evening in my candle shop, quietly working on a new scent blend while the empire I'd built was quietly reshuffling the cards of power behind the scenes. Around midnight, I heard the bell over my boutique door chime softly. I looked up to see Mom standing there, looking somehow smaller without her usual air of perfect control. Your father's been up all night, she said gently, her fingers trailing over a display of lavender candles. He reading old company reports, old proposals, especially the ones you submitted years ago. I kept working, carefully pouring wax into a new mold. Did he find anything interesting, I asked. Mom sighed, folding her arms across her chest. He found that sustainable energy proposal you wrote when you first graduated, the one he dismissed as impractical. I paused, glancing up at her. Turns out Meridian Global implemented something very similar last year, she went on. It made them millions. 200 million, actually, I corrected softly, setting my tools aside. I sold them the refined version of that same proposal through Larkspur Holdings. Mom sank into one of the shop's vintage chairs, looking around the cozy boutique as though seeing it for the first time. We really messed up, didn't we? She whispered. We never saw you. I met her gaze steadily, the gentle glow of candlelight flickering around us. No, I said quietly. You never did. You were all so busy looking down at my little shop, I said softly, that you never bothered to look up and see what else I was building. The next morning, I arrived at Larkspur Holdings, stepping into the bright lobby where glass walls reflected the Portland skyline. My entire family was waiting in the conference room. Dad looked as though he hadn't slept a wink. Lucas's designer blazer was slightly rumpled, an almost shocking sight, and Mom's eyes were red and puffy. We accept your terms, Dad said the moment I stepped in, pushing a thick, signed document across the sleek conference table. I picked up the papers, flipping through them carefully, scanning each signature. All of them? I asked, pausing at the final page. Dad gave a stiff nod. Yes, including my resignation as CEO. I met his eyes, holding his gaze. I have one question though, he said, his voice rough. Why keep the shop, Sophie, with all this? He waved a hand around the gleaming boardroom, its windows catching reflections of my own skyscraper. Why bother with that tiny space? I smiled, picturing the warmth of beeswax, the soothing swirl of essential oils, and the shelves where I still felt most like myself. Because that shop isn't about making money or proving anything, I said. It's about creating something beautiful with my own hands. It's about passion. Something you never really understood about business. Dad nodded slowly. I understand now, too late probably, but I understand. Over the next few months, Whitaker and Sons transformed under Larkspur Holdings' guidance. I appointed a young executive named Marisol as the new CEO, a woman who'd worked her way up from the bottom and who valued innovation as much as integrity. Dad stayed on as an advisor, learning more about modern business practices in 6 months than he had in 20 years of running things his way. Surprisingly, it was Lucas who showed the most change. He began stopping by my candle shop not to criticize, but to learn. I never realized how much work goes into each product, he confessed one afternoon, watching me pour a new batch of soy candles. Or how much you have to know about supply chains, rare ingredients, market fluctuations. Business lessons can come from unexpected places, I told him. Sometimes the smallest shop can teach you more than the biggest boardroom. 6 months after the merger, I hosted a family dinner. Not in a swanky restaurant, but right there in my candle shop after hours. We gathered among the glowing shelves, eating Thai takeout and sipping wine from paper cups, the air fragrant with lavender and citrus. I have something for each of you, I said, pulling out 3 small velvet boxes. Inside each was a piece of jewelry I'd crafted myself. For Dad, a pair of elegant cufflinks, engraved with a modern reimagining of the Whitaker and Sons logo. For Mom, a delicate bracelet adorned with tiny gemstones sourced from every country where Larkspur Holdings operated. And for Lucas, a minimalist pendant symbolizing that success comes in many sizes. These are amazi. Each piece tells a story, I said, looking around my little shop, the place where it had all begun. Dad cleared his throat, voice gruff. Sophie, I owe you an apology. All those years, I thought I was teaching you about business. But it turns out, you were the one with the real lessons. I raised my paper cup. Here's to lessons learned, and to small shops with big secrets. As we laughed and talked, I thought about how success doesn't always look like corner offices and towering glass buildings. Sometimes it's a warm workshop. Sometimes it's freedom. And sometimes it's finally being seen. If my journey inspired you, I'd love your support. Subscribe, share your thoughts, or leave me a message below. Tell me how you'd handle family doubters. Remember, even small passions can spark big empires. Trust yourself, stay curious, and never let anyone decide your worth. Let's grow stronger together.